The sun over Redemption Valley burned white against the timber rafters of the half-built church, and the scent of fresh sawdust mixed with perfume as townsfolk pressed close to watch the bargain masquerading as a wedding. Mary Ellen Cooper stood before the preacher in a plain calico dress too big for her frame, hands clasped so tight her knuckles whitened. She had turned 19 that morning, though no one marked it with a cake or song. Only with the papers her father signed at dawn, trading her to the wealthiest cattleman for the price of a failing ranch. Across from her, Aaron Harlow looked nothing like the stories told of him. Broad-shouldered but quiet, beard trimmed neat, a silver chain watch glinting against his vest. He didn't reach for her, didn't even look long. As though the crowd itself demanded the gesture of ownership he couldn't bring himself to perform. When the preacher asked if she would take this man, her lips trembled, but no sound came. The murmurs grew restless until her father's boot scraped the floor and she whispered a yes that tasted like dust. The ring slid onto her finger with the weight of debt, and the applause was more relief than joy. Outside, the wagon waited, piled with her dowry of linens and jars she'd never owned. Aaron lifted her trunk without a word, then handed her a small shawl as if to say he knew how cold silence could be. The road to his ranch wound through yellow grass and skeletal cottonwoods, and she kept her gaze on the horizon while he guided the horses. Not a word passed between them until twilight, when thunder rolled low and the first drops struck the brim of his hat. "We'll make the barn before dark," he said quietly, the first sound of him softer than she expected. When lightning split the hills, she saw the scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, proof he'd lived through violence, though his eyes held none. By the time they reached the barn, rain poured in silver curtains, and he opened the door, letting her step inside first. The air smelled of hay and storm, and the roof drummed steady above them. He set the lantern on a beam and looked at her, not like a man measuring property, but like one uncertain how to speak to something fragile. "You'll have your own room," he said, voice low, almost careful. She nodded, clutching her shawl. As thunder echoed, he added, "You're safe here, no matter what they paid." The words hung between them longer than the storm, a promise neither of them yet believed. Morning broke pale over the Harlow ranch, the kind of light that made even the dust seem sacred, and Mary Ellen woke to its quiet insistence on the windowsill. The guest room smelled of cedar and soap, nothing like the sour barns she had known, and beside the bed sat a folded blanket far finer than anything she owned. Through the open door came the faint sounds of clinking metal, boots on wood, and a man moving through his morning alone. She rose, hesitant, still wearing the same dress from yesterday, and found a basin of water already poured, a bar of lye soap beside it. The gesture startled her. It felt too gentle for a man said to buy his brides. Downstairs, the house spread wide and neat, walls lined with books and ledgers instead of trophies, and a kettle already hissed on the stove. Aaron stood near the back door, rolling up his sleeves as he checked his pocket watch, the motion precise, almost ritualistic. He looked at her just long enough to nod before turning away. "Breakfast's there," he said, and she saw a plate waiting, still warm. She sat, though her stomach twisted. She wasn't used to eating in silence with someone who didn't demand thanks. The ticking of the clock filled every breath between them. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked. "You don't have to be kind, sir. I know what this is." He looked up, eyes steady but unreadable. "Do you?" She flinched, but he wasn't mocking, only asking. "My father sold me because he owed you," she said. "That's what this is." Aaron's jaw tightened, then eased. "Your father's debt was cleared, yes, but no one owns you here." She almost laughed from disbelief. "Then why bring me?" He looked out the window toward the hills. "Maybe I'm trying to stop being the man who lets other men break things." She didn't understand it, but the words caught something deep in her chest, a feeling like grief that wasn't hers. After breakfast, he saddled his horse and left without saying where, leaving her with an empty house full of echoes. The hours crawled. She swept, washed, folded, all without reason except to prove she existed. When the wind picked up, she stood by the porch rail and watched dust devils chase each other across the yard. By sunset, he returned carrying supplies: flour, lamp oil, a bolt of blue cloth. He set them on the table and paused. "That color might suit you," he said, then added, "You can sew, can't you?" She nodded, surprised he'd thought to ask. "Then keep it," he murmured. "It's not payment, it's choice." She wanted to speak, but the words tangled behind her teeth. That night she sat by the window, sewing by lantern glow while he mended harness straps across the room. The air filled with the soft rhythm of work, two people moving around the memory of vows neither wanted. Outside, coyotes called under a moon sharp as glass. He looked up once, met her eyes, and for a fleeting second she saw the truth. He wasn't a monster or savior, just a man trying to remember what mercy looked like in his own house. The following morning came wrapped in silence, the kind that seemed to press against the walls until even breath felt like an intrusion. Mary Ellen found Aaron already outside splitting wood, his shirt damp with sweat, the early sun burning pale over the ridgeline. She watched from the doorway, the thin veil she'd kept over her hair still pinned like armor against the world. He noticed her there but didn't speak, just nodded once before striking another log. The crack echoed like thunder. Inside, the smell of bread rising filled the air. She'd learned the kitchen by memory now, though she still handled every dish as if it weren't hers to touch. By noon, she carried a plate out to the porch. Cornbread, a jar of milk, and the smallest courage she owned. "You forgot to eat," she said, setting it on the railing. He wiped his hands, looking at her only after she turned to leave. "You don't have to serve me." "Then who else would?" she asked quietly, and her words fell heavier than the wood he'd been splitting. The afternoon heat drove him back indoors, and for the first time they shared a room without distance. He at the table with his ledgers, she near the window hemming the blue cloth he'd brought. The sound of the clock filled the air again, a metronome for 2 lives trying not to touch. After a while, he said, "You don't have to wear that." She froze, needle halfway through the fabric. "What?" "The veil," he said gently. "No one here to judge you." Her fingers went cold. "It's not for them." He didn't ask again, only nodded as if he understood something she hadn't said. Evening fell soft, painting the ranch gold. When the wind picked up, it lifted the corner of her veil, brushing her cheek like a question. She caught it, tied it tighter. The motion didn't escape him. "You afraid I'll look?" he asked, tone even. She turned towards the window, heart thudding. "I'm afraid of what looking does to men." He set down his pen. "Then I'll keep my eyes down." And he did. For the rest of that meal, he never looked her way. Not once. Not even when she poured his coffee or when the lantern sputtered and she reached to steady it, their hands nearly touching. That night, thunder rolled far off again, the same storm returning from the hills, and she dreamed of her wedding day. The crowd's laughter, her father's signature, the sound of rain on a roof not yet hers. She woke before dawn, veil still tied, heart pounding. Through the open door she saw Aaron asleep in the chair by the dying fire, his hat over his eyes, as though he'd stayed up to guard her dreams. She wanted to wake him, to thank him, to say something that might turn their silence into a bridge. But the words stayed where her fear lived. Instead, she reached for the quilt and draped it over his shoulders before retreating to her room. When he stirred moments later, he saw the edge of fabric still warm from her hands, and smiled, small and tired, as if the storm outside had finally found reason to rest. By the third week, the silence between them had become something living, pacing the halls like a tame animal that refused to bite. The house had settled into rhythm. 2 separate rooms, 2 separate breaths, one uneasy peace. At dawn, Aaron's boots thudded against the porch as he left for the fields, and by the time Mary Ellen rose, his shadow was already a part of the valley's horizon. She cleaned, cooked, mended, anything to keep from hearing her own thoughts, though she had started to notice small things about him. How he never slammed a door, how he always placed his hat on the peg nearest hers, how he whistled only when he thought no one listened. One afternoon, while sweeping the hallway, she caught her reflection in the small mirror by the stairs and froze. The veil hung crooked, smudged from dust, her eyes pale with sleeplessness. She thought of removing it then, of facing the woman beneath, but a sudden knock on the outer door stopped her. A traveling merchant stood there, smiling too wide, asking for Mr. Harlow. When she said he was gone, the man's gaze drifted over her in a way that felt like a hand. She stepped back, heart pounding, until Aaron's voice came from behind her, low but firm. "She said he's gone," he repeated, and the merchant turned, startled. Aaron stood there with a length of rope in one hand, and a look that made the man's grin die. "Move along," he said quietly, and the merchant left without another word. When the wagon rolled away, Aaron turned to her, still calm but pale. "You lock the door when I'm gone," he said, setting the rope down. She nodded. "You came back early." He looked at the ground. "Didn't feel right leaving the house empty." The rest of the day passed like a held breath. At supper, neither spoke, yet when she stood to clear the table, he stopped her. "Leave it, I'll do it." She hesitated. "It's my work." "Not tonight," he said softly, gathering the plates himself. When he passed her room later, the door was half open, the lamp still burning. He paused, one hand on the frame, the other holding her folded shawl. He could have stepped inside. No one would know, no one would stop him. But instead he left the shawl gently on the chair outside and walked away. She heard his footsteps fade down the hall and felt something inside her loosen. Not trust yet, but a kind of relief that a man could still choose restraint. When she opened the door, the shawl lay waiting, its fringe brushing the floor like a promise. She picked it up, pressed it to her chest, and for the first time since her wedding day, she cried without shame. Downstairs, Aaron sat by the cold stove, hands clasped, staring at nothing. The wind moved through the cracks, whispering through the old wood, and he whispered back, "Let her sleep safe." It wasn't a prayer, not really, but the night took it anyway. The first frost came early that year, white breath over the valley, sharp on the wind, and by the time dawn lifted, Mary Ellen had fallen sick. It began with a chill she couldn't shake, and a cough that hollowed her chest, the kind that made the world swim in gray. Aaron found her still sitting by the hearth, arms wrapped around herself, trying to stir a pot she could barely hold upright. "You should be in bed," he said, crossing the room before she could argue. She shook her head, stubborn even now. "There's work." "Not today." His tone left no space between words. He carried her easily, though she protested weakly, up the narrow stairs and into her small room. She wanted to fight, to remind him she was not his to touch, but the warmth of his arms and the steadiness of his breath stole the will from her body. He laid her down and stepped back immediately, as if the nearness itself burned. "I'll get water," he said, and left. When he returned with a bowl and cloth, she was shivering, eyes half closed. "You don't have to." "I do," he said simply. He sat at her bedside, dipping the cloth into cool water, pressing it gently to her forehead. Every motion was deliberate, almost reverent, like a man tending a fire he was afraid to feed too much. Through fever haze, she caught glimpses of him. The scar along his jaw, the tired lines beneath his eyes, the way his lips moved as if speaking prayers he didn't believe in anymore. "Why are you kind?" she whispered once. "Because someone should have been to you sooner," he murmured, wringing the cloth again. The day bled into evening, and the fever worsened. He lit a lamp, kept the curtains drawn, spooned her sips of broth when she could manage them. Each time she stirred, he looked away until she stilled again. At midnight, she began to mutter half-dreamed things, names, apologies, her father's voice tangled in fear, and he sat there, helpless. He tried to pray but could only whisper, "Don't take her, Lord, not for my sins." When the fever finally broke near dawn, sweat slicking her hair, he exhaled a sound between relief and exhaustion. He changed the sheets, opened the window to let the frost air in, and stayed seated in the chair beside her bed until morning filled the room. She woke to find him asleep there, head bowed, fingers still clutching the damp cloth. For the first time, she studied him without the shield of fear, the lines carved by guilt, the roughness of hands that had learned to build instead of strike. She reached out, trembling, and touched his sleeve. His eyes opened instantly, wary but gentle. "I didn't mean to wake you," she whispered. "I wasn't sleeping," he replied. The faintest smile ghosted across her lips. "You should rest." He shook his head, the corner of his mouth tilting. "If I rest, you'll get up and work again." She laughed softly, and it startled them both. Outside, the frost melted off the fences like silver tears, and for the first time since her wedding day, the light didn't hurt. The fever passed, but something gentler stayed behind. A silence no longer sharp but warm, the kind that filled the house like sunlight through thin curtains. Mary Ellen rose from bed on the third morning, weak yet steady, wrapped in the shawl Aaron had left folded at the foot of the bed. When she stepped into the kitchen, he was already there by the stove, frying cornmeal and humming low, unaware she'd come down. The sound caught her by surprise. It was a hymn, half forgotten, one her mother used to sing before Sunday meals. She watched him for a long time before speaking. "You know that song." He turned, startled, spatula midair, then smiled faintly. "My mother, too," he said, almost apologetically. She sat, hands trembling from exhaustion more than nerves. He poured coffee without asking, placed it before her, and took the seat across, but didn't drink his own. Words seemed unnecessary. The air was already full of things said by gesture. She tore a piece of bread and pushed the rest toward him. "Eat," she murmured. He obeyed, almost shy, like the act itself was communion. After breakfast, they stepped outside together for the first time since the storm that brought her there. The world had changed. Frost still on the fences, the valley lit gold where the sun struck the ice, smoke curling from the chimney like breath from something alive. He handed her a coat without speaking, and they walked the fence line in companionable silence. Each step left twin prints in the pale mud, proof of coexistence, not ownership. At the far pasture, one of the younger mares had tangled herself in a loose wire, and Aaron knelt to free her. "Hold this," he said, passing her the rope. She crouched beside him, their shoulders brushing once. The mare shivered, panicked, but he kept murmuring soft, steady words until the wire slipped free. When it did, she reached instinctively, her hand falling over his for balance. The contact was brief but electric, not romantic yet, just human, unguarded, real. She pulled back, embarrassed. "Sorry." "Don't be," he said quietly, still watching the mare trot away. "You've got steadier hands than most." They lingered there a while, neither moving, neither needing to. Back at the house, she took up sewing again near the window, mending the same blue cloth she'd started weeks ago. He worked at the table, carving a small handle for her broom. Something he'd noticed splintered. No words crossed the room, but every sound did. The scrape of wood. The sigh of thread through fabric, the rhythm of a life rebuilding itself without announcement. When the sun sank, he stood, stretched, and left a cup of warm milk by her elbow. "You'll need strength," he said. "For what?" she asked. "For peace," he answered, and went upstairs. She watched him go, heart unsteady. Later she found the carved handle polished smooth, initials etched so faintly it seemed accidental. M.E. She traced them with her finger, half afraid, half grateful. Outside, the valley slept quiet under its pale sky, and inside, for the first time, the silence between them felt like prayer. By late winter, the valley had turned brittle and gray, the kind of season when people remembered debts they'd forgotten in kinder weather. It was just past sundown when the knocking started. Hard, hurried, the sound of men who didn't come to visit. Aaron rose from his chair near the fire, his expression unreadable. Mary Ellen froze, the needle slipping from her hand. He opened the door to find 3 figures on the porch, their coats stiff with dust and faces set in that familiar blend of arrogance and hunger. The one in front, Randall Cooper, her cousin, tipped his hat mockingly. "Evenin', Harlow. Word's been travelin' that you got yourself a runaway bride under your roof." Mary Ellen's breath caught. Her cousin's voice was the same drawl that had laughed when her father signed her away. Aaron's jaw tightened. "She's my wife," he said evenly. Randall smirked. "Paper don't change blood. Uncle says the marriage ain't finished. Says she owes him what was paid." The words turned her stomach. She stood behind the doorway's shadow, trembling. Aaron didn't move. "You tell your uncle," he said, "that what he bought was forgiven the moment he sold it." Randall chuckled. "That ain't how business works, cowboy." His hand drifted toward his belt, resting near the revolver. Aaron stepped outside, closing the door behind him with a calm that felt heavier than any threat. Mary Ellen pressed her ear to the wood. She heard the crunch of boots, the murmur of low voices, the metallic whisper of a gun sliding free. Then Aaron's voice. "I don't raise hands against kin, but I won't let them touch her either." Silence followed. Then the sound of horses shifting nervously. "You think you can hide a debt behind mercy?" Randall spat. "I don't hide it," Aaron said. "I pay it different." The next sound was a fist, then boots scuffling. Mary Ellen burst through the door before she could stop herself. Randall had Aaron by the collar, his gun drawn, but the barrel wavered. "You'd fight over damaged goods?" Randall hissed. "No," Aaron said, breathing hard. "I'd kneel before her before I let you call her that." And he did, dropped to one knee right there in the dirt, his hat falling to the ground. The other men hesitated, unsure what to do with a man who fought by surrendering. Randall lowered the gun, uneasy now, muttered something about fools and saints, then spat on the ground and walked off. The others followed, their shapes fading into dusk. When Aaron stood, blood streaked his lip, his shirt torn. Mary Ellen ran to him, gripping his sleeve. "Why didn't you fight?" she cried. He wiped the blood away and met her gaze. "Because I already did, just not with them." Inside, she cleaned his cuts by lamplight, hands shaking as she dabbed the cloth. He didn't flinch. "You shouldn't have come out," he whispered. "You shouldn't have knelt," she whispered back. He smiled faintly. "Then we're both stubborn." She laughed through tears, the sound breaking the air like thawed ice. Outside, the night wind carried the last echo of hooves away from the ranch, and the silence that followed was the purest peace she'd ever heard. Word of the standoff spread faster than wildfire through Redemption Valley, twisting as it traveled, until by Sunday every pew in the church whispered the same half-truth. The rich cowboy had knelt to his virgin bride. Mary Ellen felt the weight of every stare as she and Aaron rode into town that morning. The stares of men who didn't understand mercy, and women who no longer trusted it. She wanted to stay behind, but he'd insisted they face it together. The buggy creaked over the frozen ruts, the wind snapping her veil against her cheek. When they reached the square, people slowed their steps. Even the blacksmith paused his hammer. Sheriff Dobbs stood on the courthouse steps, hat low, eyes sharp. "Harlow," he called. "Folks are saying you pulled a gun on Kin." Aaron dismounted slowly, helping her down before answering. "No gun," he said simply. "Just a truth that needed standing up for." The sheriff's gaze shifted to Mary Ellen. "That true, miss?" She swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. He protected me." The crowd murmured. Randall was there too, leaning against the post like a man rehearsing righteousness. "Protected her?" he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "He shamed our family in front of half the valley." Aaron turned, calm but steady. "Your family shamed itself when it sold her." Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Such things weren't spoken plain in daylight. Randall's face flushed red. "You talk bold for a man who hides behind a woman's tears." Aaron's voice stayed level. "I stand beside them, not behind." The sheriff looked uneasy, but the crowd had already shifted, sensing the direction of truth. A woman from the general store, Mrs. Lang, known for gossip sharper than knives, stepped forward, holding out her shawl to Mary Ellen. "You keep this, dear," she said quietly. "It's cold today." The gesture spread like brush fire. One by one, townsfolk nodded, silent acknowledgments of a story they hadn't known how to believe until now. Randall spat in the dirt and stalked away. The sheriff cleared his throat. "Seems law's got no quarrel here. Let the matter rest." Aaron tipped his hat once, then turned to Mary Ellen. "You ready to go home?" She nodded, tears threatening but held firm. As they climbed back into the buggy, someone from the crowd, a boy barely 12, called out, "Mr. Harlow, why'd you bow?" Aaron paused, reins in hand, voice carrying soft but sure. "Because that's how a man stands when he's done takin' and ready to start givin'." The words hung in the winter air long after they'd left town. On the ride back, neither spoke, but every mile of road between them and Redemption Valley seemed to shed a piece of the past. When they reached the ridge, the wind died, and she looked over at him. "You never asked me if I forgive you," she said. "You never owed me that," he replied. "Only peace." And for the first time, she didn't look away. The church bell tolled behind them, low and steady, as if even heaven had heard. Spring crept back into the valley like a long-awaited apology, softening the frost and turning the riverbanks green again. The ranch that had once felt like a cage now breathed with the quiet rhythm of two people who had stopped pretending not to need one another. Mary Ellen woke earlier these days, pulling her hair back with the same blue ribbon she'd sewn from that bolt of cloth. And she often found Aaron already outside, repairing fences or coaxing life from the stubborn earth. He always nodded when she appeared at the doorway, that single gesture carrying more tenderness than most men's words. They no longer lived behind locked doors or silence, though words still came slow. Once, while gathering eggs, she found him kneeling beside the chicken coop, fixing a latch that had broken in the storm. He looked up and smiled, the same tired, gentle smile that had undone her fear. "You don't have to mend everything," she said softly. He shrugged. "Mending's what keeps things alive." That night they ate together without the weight of unspoken debts. She laughed at something he said about a mule too stubborn for his own good, and the sound filled the room like music. Still, the world beyond their fence hadn't forgotten them. Some evenings, riders passed on the ridge, shadows against the last light, slowing just enough to remind them that mercy wasn't the law everywhere. Aaron never carried a gun again. He said it made people think too small of peace. Instead, he built fences higher, planted windbreak trees, and taught her how to guide the plow when the horse hesitated. "You don't fight the ground," he told her once, hands over hers on the handles. "You listen to it." She smiled. The dirt cool under her nails, the sky enormous above. By summer the house had changed too. Curtains she'd sewn fluttered in the windows, a rug she'd bartered for lay near the hearth, and laughter echoed in the rooms that had once feared sound. One afternoon, as they were repainting the porch rail, a wagon approached, Mrs. Lang again, this time with her husband. They brought seeds, a gift from the townsfolk. "Figure you two know a thing or two about growing," she said with a wink. Mary Ellen thanked her, and after they left, she stood with the packet in her hands, hesitant. "Do we plant them?" she asked. Aaron nodded. "We build things now, not burn 'em." That evening they planted together, fingers touching once in the dark soil, both pretending not to notice. When the last seed was buried, they sat on the porch steps, boots dusty, listening to the night frogs by the creek. Neither spoke of love. They didn't need to. The air itself carried it, quiet and steady. Before turning in, she looked over at him. "You bowed for me once," she said. "Would you do it again?" He smiled faintly. "Only if you stand beside me this time." And she did. Barefoot in the cool dirt, facing the same horizon, two hearts finally free of fear, building a home without saying the word. The morning broke golden and slow, light spilling across the valley as though the sun itself had decided to stay a little longer. The house no longer creaked from emptiness. It hummed with small sounds, fire crackling, coffee boiling, boots moving across wood. Mary Ellen stood at the doorway in a cotton dress the color of dawn, bareheaded at last, her hair loose down her back. The veil lay folded on the table behind her, untouched for weeks. Outside, Aaron was by the corral, brushing the bay mare with long, steady strokes. His shoulders relaxed, his face calm in a way it had never been before. She watched him for a moment, the gentle rhythm of his hand against the horse's neck, before stepping onto the porch. "You're up early," he said, without turning. "I wanted to see the day start," she replied. "It feels different now." He smiled. Eyes still on the horse. "It is different. We're still here." She walked closer, the grass cool under her feet, and for the first time in months she wasn't afraid of being seen. He finally looked at her then, and whatever passed between them didn't need words, just the quiet recognition of two souls that had carried shame too long and found it useless. "I thought I'd never be anything but someone's debt," she said softly. He set the brush down. "You were never a debt," he answered. "Just someone the world forgot to be kind to." A silence followed, deep and alive, until she reached out and touched his sleeve. He covered her hand with his, rough fingers careful. "We don't owe each other, Mary Ellen," he said. "We just build from here." Behind them, the wind moved through the trees, lifting dust into sunlight like a blessing. They spent the rest of the morning mending fences and laughing at a stubborn calf that refused the gate, their laughter echoing off the hills. When they paused to rest, she sat on the porch rail, watching the horizon. "Do you ever think about that day in town?" she asked. "Every day," he said. "Not for shame, just to remember that kneeling doesn't always mean surrender." She nodded, smiling. "Then I'll remember it too." Later, when the noon bell from Redemption rang faintly through the valley, she carried 2 cups of coffee to the porch. He took one, and they drank in silence, the world stretching wide before them. No chains, no whispers, no debt collectors, just peace. Down by the creek, the first shoots of the seeds they'd planted broke through the soil, green and stubborn against the wind. She pointed toward them. "They made it." He nodded. "So did we." When evening came, she leaned against him, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders, his chin resting lightly on her hair. The sky turned rose and gold, the same color as her dress, the same warmth as the life they'd chosen. "It's quiet," she whispered. "That's the sound of a home," he said. And as the light faded, neither spoke again. They didn't need to. The silence said everything that love, at last, had earned. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you saw a young bride standing alone while the rich cowboy bowed instead of claiming her, would you have called it weakness or mercy? Tell us in the comments. Tell